Welcome back, Exiles. It's Naidra. In my last video I posted, which was the updated Fireball Comet build for the Sorceress, I had some questions in the comments regarding how well this build does specifically against bosses. While I had some people saying it does really well, other people were not quite sold on that idea. And so for today, I wanted to put a video together to show you guys exactly what this build can do. You guys saw what it looks like in AoE, but I also wanted to show you guys what this looks like against single enemies, more specifically going up against a Citadel boss. And so with that said, for today, I have made a couple of adjustments to the build, so I'm just going to assume if you're watching this video that you haven't seen it before. For those of you that have, you might be familiar with what's about to happen, but today I will take you through the demo and show you guys exactly what this does against bosses, and then we'll go back to town where I will show you guys what the build looks like. We'll take a look at our equipment, our skills, and also our passive skill tree as well. So before we dive in, if you guys have not yet subscribed to the channel, please don't forget to do so below. Let's go ahead and dive right in. All right, so this is the very first time that I am trying to take on a Citadel boss. We're going to go for Count Geonor first. And so what's important to know here is, first off, we're casting Sigil of Power. This is what allows us to increase the damage output that we have. And then next, we want to double up on our curses that we're using against him, since we have both conductivity and hypothermia. And then other than that, you just want to try to avoid the attacks as much as possible while spamming your attacks. Now, as you can see, we've got Frostwall that's being automatically cast, and once Raging Skulls impact Frostwall, it is triggering Comet to cast a little bit faster, so that is really helpful. We do also have Eye of Winter, which is helping with the critical weaknesses as well, so super helpful there. Once you've set this up, you can just start spamming. Now, one thing that I didn't do that you can do is you can put a Thawing Charm on here. I did get frozen a couple of times while going up against this boss, which made it really difficult to move around, obviously, as we're frozen. And then the other thing you can do to prepare yourself for this is make sure that you've stacked up on your Grim Feast. As you noticed, we did get hit a couple of times, but still we didn't take very much damage to our actual health, so we are able to tank some of the damage, which means as long as we're able to shoot out those fireballs, everything else should automatically happen on its own. So as you guys can see, we were able to take this boss down in about a minute and 30 seconds or so. Alrighty, so now that you guys have seen what this build is capable of, I'm going to take you through and show you exactly what this build entails. So first off, we'll go ahead and start with our equipment. For our equipment, starting with our wand, we are going to be using a withered wand. It doesn't really matter exactly what the wand is, as long as we've got these specific modifiers on the bottom. So one of the most important things we're looking at here is our spell damage. We want to make sure we have specifically increased spell damage. We don't want to have increased fire damage, and we also don't necessarily want increased lightning damage. If you can get increased spell damage specifically, that would be great. You can also do increased cold damage, but then that's only going to apply to our cold skills. And remember, we are also dealing lightning damage with this build in addition to cold damage, so having increased spell damage is going to be perfect. The next thing we want to look at on here is having maximum mana. The more mana we can have, the better. This one has plus 100, but if you can get something that's got even higher than that, that's going to be perfect. Because with this build, we are no longer using the Eldritch Battery, we do want to make sure we're stacking up on mana as much as we can. Next up, we've got +2 to level of all spell skills. If you don't have +2 to level of spell skills, or +3 or +4, whatever it may be, you're more than welcome to use something that's got +2 cold spell skills specifically. This does, however, work because we are also dealing lightning damage as well. And then we've got 49% increased critical hit chance for spells. We need to make sure we're getting a lot of critical hit chance. We are relying on crits to deal a lot of damage as well. So having around 50% on your wand is going to be extremely helpful. And then lastly, once again, because we did remove the Eldritch Battery, we are going to struggle with mana if we don't have high mana, and also if you don't have some good mana regeneration. So having 21 mana per enemy killed is going to be extremely helpful. Taking a look at our first ring, we are using prismatic rings, and that's because prismatic rings give us +2 all elemental resistances as an implicit, so really helpful with that. Now, we don't care about the fire damage, so we definitely could do without that. If you can get something that gives you plus additional life, would be great, but what we really want to make sure we have on here is the 145 to maximum mana, extremely helpful. The increased rarity of items found helps out a lot as well. I found about 4 or 5 divine orbs over the past 2 days, and I'm attributing that specifically to the increased rarity of items found that I have on my gear. Next up, we're getting 10% increased cast speed. Really helpful. We want to be able to cast as quickly as possible, so that's great. The +6 to all elemental resistances is a little bit weak. If we can get +10 or more would be fantastic, but nonetheless, we'll still take it. With what we've got here, we are still pretty close to our maximum resistances for all of our elements, so we'll take a look at that in just a moment here. And then lastly, again, we've got 27 mana per enemy killed. This is great. We want to get as much of that as possible. That's really mostly just going to be helpful in AoE situations. When you're going up against bosses, it's not going to help because we're not really killing any enemies there. But if you're going up against groups of enemies, really, really good to have this. Next up for our gloves, the first thing we want to make sure we have on here is increased energy shield. So for mine, I've got 45%. We also want to make sure we've got some good amount of life and good amount of mana as well. So we're getting 125 to our max life and 167 to our max mana. And then the other thing we're getting on here is resistances, fire resistance, chaos resistance. We do struggle a little bit with our chaos resistances, and so we're going to be making that up via our gear. And then lastly, once again, we're getting 15 mana per enemy killed here as well, which is great for AoE. For our rune, we are using an iron rune. This is giving us an extra 20% increased energy shield, and that is specific to this piece of equipment, but nonetheless, it does still help out with our energy shield. So we're gonna go ahead and take that. If you're struggling with specific resistances and you have higher energy shield, you are more than welcome to replace this rune for something else that gives you some resistance if you'd like, but I'm finding that this is the most helpful with my current setup here. And then taking a look at our helmet, so this one we've replaced. Previously we were using Aziri's Disdain, which was really helpful. However, in this case, we did replace that. A, we're getting some additional resistances by doing so. And then B, it balances out our energy shield along with our health as well. While it does decrease our mana a bit, we are making up for that decrease in the mana regeneration rate that we have, and also the mana per enemy killed when we're going up against AoE. And so for our helmet, we're looking for something that's got maximum energy shield and also increased energy shield. And then we want to have as much maximum life and mana on here as possible as well. So we're getting plus 156 to our life, and we're getting plus 37 to our max mana. And then lastly, we're getting triple resistances here. This is really important. Again, this is what's going to help us get to that maximum resistance. And so 33 to cold resistance, 26 to lightning resistance, and 25 to chaos resistance. My build is a little bit overkilled with the cold resistance, but if you can balance that out with whatever it is that your build is needing, that would be great. But really helpful to have something with tri-res on your helmet. And then same idea for our rune here. We are using an iron rune. The iron rune is giving us an extra 20% increased energy shield, so really helpful overall. If you can get one that's got dual sockets on here, then I would probably do the same thing and an additional iron rune onto that as well. For our chest armor, we are using something that's got maximum energy shield and also increased energy shield once again. If you can get an implicit of mana regeneration rate, that would be absolutely phenomenal. We need as much of that as we possibly can get. And then we also want to try to get as much life on here as possible. What is crucial to this build, especially for this piece of equipment, is that we're getting some plus 2 spirit. We need to make sure we have a lot of spirit because we are using a lot of buff skills. And so mine's got plus 43. At this point, if I can get 10 more, that'll allow me to use blink. So I'm almost there, but minimum we probably want to have around 40 to spirit on your chest armor. And then once again, we're getting triple resistances here as well. While my chaos resistance is pretty weak, if we can get the chaos resistance to around 20, we'll be fully maxed out on all of our elemental resistances. And then for our runes, we're using iron rune for both. This allows us to get an additional 40% increased energy shield, which brings the energy shield for this item up to 397 when you improve the quality of it. And then for our belt, we are using the Midnight Braid. I have played around with this and swapped it out with a couple of other ones. The helpful part of this gives us 24% increased maximum energy shield as an implicit, which is really great. We're getting plus 10 to all elemental resistances, but really the part that helps out the most is 50% of the damage that we're taking is recouped as mana. If you're finding that you don't need that, you can definitely swap it out for something else. While you're not going to be able to get the increased maximum energy shield, you will be able to get something that's potentially got triple resistance, maybe some more mana, and maybe some additional life as well, but this one seems to work pretty well for me. For our amulet, we've got the Fireflower Solar Amulet. Now, this piece is absolutely necessary for this build to work. Everything else on this build we can do without, but for this one, if you don't have Fire Flower, you're not going to be able to make this work. What it's doing is, because we're using Necromantic Talisman on our passive skill tree, all of the damage that we take from this is instead going to our minions, and the faster our minions die, the faster we can cast Comet, so we do need to make sure that we're doing that. Now, all of these modifiers are going towards your minions, and so when we see the +2 to level of all fire skills, that is not being applied towards your raging spirits. And then next up, we've got our second ring, which, just like previously, this one is also a prismatic ring. We're getting +9 to all elemental resistances from this. We don't care about the physical damage, but getting some additional maximum life is great. If we can get some additional maximum mana to this, would be absolutely amazing. Unfortunately, we're not quite there yet. We do get 11% increased rarity of items found. The +5 to all attributes is somewhat helpful. The intelligence is great. And then +14 to all elemental resistances is absolutely amazing. So really, really good to have. Next, we've got our boots. We are using expert feathered sandals, which is great. Doesn't really matter exactly what that is, as long as you're getting increased movement speed. The 20% increased movement speed is bare minimum for this build. Anything lower than that is going to make it really difficult to move around and to dodge enemies' attacks. 20% is good. If you can get this up to 30 or 35%, that would be perfect. It would make it so much easier for you to be able to dodge those attacks and also make sure you're getting additional attacks in there. We've got 23% increased energy shield. We definitely want to have as much energy shield as possible. We've got some really good mana on here, +152. Some rarity of items found. That one, again, is not necessary, but it does help if you're farming. And then we've got a couple of resistances on here. We got fire resistance, lightning resistance, and then +30 to stun threshold. I don't care so much about the stun threshold. I would love to instead have an additional elemental resistance on here, but for now, that'll have to do. Once again, for our rune, we're using Iron Rune for these guys as well. And then for our offhand, we're using an Omen Scepter. This allows us to have Malice on it, which is definitely very, very helpful. Malice inflicts critical weakness on your enemies, which makes it a little bit easier to take them down. So definitely make sure you've got that on there. And then what's really important about this is that we're getting at least 60% or more increased spirit. The mana is absolutely great to have. The strength is really helpful too. And then the increased mana regeneration rate is super helpful. We definitely want to avoid having any type of buffs that go to your minions, especially when it comes to their defenses or their elemental resistances. We want to try to keep that to a minimum. Once again, we want those minions to die as quickly as possible. That's what's casting those comets more frequently. So we want to make sure that we're not giving them any type of buffs to prevent them from dying as quickly as they are. Now, if you do have a scepter that's giving you 60% increased spirit, but you're still not quite at the spirit number that you need to be able to use all of your buffs, what you may need to do for that is make sure that you improve the quality of your scepter. And so as you can see, mine's at 20% right now, and each time we improve the quality, it's going to increase your spirit as well. You probably won't need to go all the way up to 20% for it, but you will need to probably get to at least 15% or more in order to get the amount of spirit that you need. If you can get something that's going up to 90% increased spirit, that would be absolutely great. That's what I'm aiming for in order to be able to add blink onto this build as well. But for right now, this is working absolutely great. And then our last piece of equipment that we have is our staff. So we're using a chiming staff. It absolutely does not matter what modifiers this has at the bottom, because we're really not using it for any other purpose except for to cast Sigil of Power. We're casting Sigil of Power mostly against bosses, and since this video is specific to bossing, we definitely need to make sure that we have this on. But again, all of the other modifiers really don't matter on here at all. All right, so now that we've looked at our equipment, let's go ahead and take a look at our skills. For our skills, we're going to start off with Malice, and we're going to go ahead and add Persistence onto that. For Sigil of Power, we don't need to add anything on there. This works just the way that it is. If you want to add Magnified Effect to this, you can, but right now we're using that on our Comet, so you can leave it blank. And then we've got Grim Feast. And Grim Feast is extremely helpful. This is what allows our energy shield to overflow. So although it only gives us 172 energy shield per remnant that we pick up, this allows us to make sure that we can overflow that. And so right now I currently have 4,152 energy shield. However, this will allow us to double on that. And so ultimately I can take this all the way up to about 8,304 energy shield as long as I'm picking up those remnants without getting hit. This is really helpful to have, especially when you are planning on going up against bosses. This basically doubles up on your defenses as long as you can collect those remnants before you hit that boss. So really helpful and really important to have. And then we are going to add clarity onto this as well, so it can help us with some additional increased mana regeneration while this is active, which is pretty much all the time. Next up, we've got hypothermia, and this is something that's new to this build. Previously, we did not use hypothermia, but because we are wanting to make sure that we're inflicting as much damage as possible to our bosses, we're going to go ahead and double up on our curses. So we're still going to keep conductivity, and we'll get to that in just a moment, but we do want to make sure that we're taking advantage of this as well in order to take them down pretty quickly. We're not going to add any support gems to this, so we can just keep it blank as it is. We're using our support gems on our conductivity. Next up, we've got Fireball, which as previously, we are pairing this up with Scattershot, and then we're also going to be taking Unleash, Ricochet, then we've got Arcane Tempo, and finally Mobility. So I keep switching up this last one that we have here, but I keep finding Mobility to be the most helpful. This reduces the penalty that we're getting while we're using Fireball, and so this makes it really helpful because you can be running up to your enemy and already casting your Fireball without having to come to a complete stop. And also, if you're trying to dodge your enemies, you can also continue casting, which really makes it super helpful. So finding Mobility to be the best option for the 5th slot here. We are also using Eye of Winter, which we're pairing up with Strip Away. And then we're also taking Cold Exposure and Inevitable Critical. For our Raging Spirits, we're taking Infernal Legion, and then taking that up to Feeding Frenzy, following up with Minion Instability, and finally Fire Exposure. For our first cast on Minion Death, we're using Comet, and then we're also using Spell Cascade along with Inspiration. Then we've got Spell Echo, and finally Magnified Effect. And like I mentioned, if you'd like, you can take this magnified effect off of here and place it onto your Sigil of Power while you're going up against bosses. This will increase the area of the Sigil of Power, which will allow you to move around a little bit more while you're casting your attacks and still benefiting from the increased damage that you're getting from Sigil of Power. So you can make that switch if you'd like to. I didn't feel the need for that. As you guys saw in the video previously, I was able to take it down with exactly what we have here, and we were able to do that pretty quickly. So I don't think you need to, but if you're finding that you're struggling with it, go ahead and swap that out. Then we've got Conductivity, which we are pairing up with Focused Curse, and then Heightened Curse, and finally Hex Bloom. And then we've got our second cast on Minion Death. I'm still using Frostfall for this. I'm finding Frostfall to be helpful. Once your Raging Spirits crash into Frostwall, this also triggers Comets to happen a little bit more frequently. Some of you guys are saying you're struggling getting around the Frostwalls. Typically, I can just evade right around that. But if you're having a hard time with it, you don't have to use this. You can add an additional Comet if you'd prefer, and if you have them on it to support it. I'm also hearing some people are using Firewall instead. It's up to you what you do with this. This part is not necessary, but I personally am finding this to be helpful just because I'm seeing that Comet is triggering a little bit faster when I'm pairing it up with this. We are then pairing this up with Impetus, and then we've got Lightning Exposure, Glacier, and finally Rising Tempest. And then for our last skill, we are using Archmage as normal, and we are pairing that one up with Lightning Mastery. All right, so now we know what our skills look like, and I think this goes without saying, but your Sigil of Power is going to be linked to the secondary item that we have, since that's what it comes from. And then lastly, we'll take a look at our passive skill tree. For our passive skill tree, this remained relatively similar to our last video. So starting off with our ascendancies, we're going to go over to the left and take Elemental Resistances along with Heart of the Storm. And then on the right, we're going to take elemental damage along with Scouring Winds. And then we're going to follow the path on the left-hand side, taking Mana, Constant Gale, Mana again, and finishing it up with Force of Will. We'll then move on up to the regular skill tree here, where we're going to move up the right-hand side, taking energy shield and moving it up to the left-hand side and stopping at pure energy. We'll then continue making our way up the left-hand side, taking dampening shield and stopping for mana blessing before we continue making our way up. Obviously, for these attribute nodes, you can take whatever attributes you need specifically. For me, I do need this additional strength and dexterity that I've got up here, but you can cater this towards what your build needs and what your equipment looks like. But we'll go ahead and veer off to the left-hand side here before we make our way up, stopping at the right-hand side to grab energy shield nodes, including heavy buffer. And then we'll continue making our way up the left-hand side, where then we'll fork over to the left and all the way down, taking the calibration node here, and then also taking the desensitization node on the left. And then we'll make our way down where we will then grab spell area of effect, and then also grab repulsion. We will eventually grab reverberation as well. For now, we're going to go without just because we have a better use for these points right now. But in the next couple of levels, I will be taking this as well to help with the increased area of effect. And then we'll make our way up where we will grab all natural for some increased elemental damage and also a little bit of elemental resistance. We'll then make our way over to the right, where we will be stopping at Necromantic Talisman. It is extremely important that you guys have this on. This is what's allowing your amulet effects to apply to your minions instead of you. So that's where that additional 100 damage that we're taking from the amulet applies to your minion, causing them to die faster, which means we see more casts on minion death, meaning we see more comets. And then we'll continue making our way over to the right, where we'll grab overexposure and the nodes surrounding it. Continuing on to the right, we'll stop at the bottom here for sudden escalation for some increased critical hit chance. And then we'll make our way up and grab these 4 nodes on the right. We're going to grab refocus. We do need some additional increased energy shield recharge rate, and this also helps us with our increased mana regeneration rate. The more increased mana regeneration rate, the better. That allows us to continue attacking more frequently, even though our mana has gone down a bit from where we were at previously. 1900 or 2000 is perfect as long as we've got a decent mana recovery rate, which again, we'll take a look at the stats right after we get through the rest of this skill tree here. And then we'll continue to make our way over to the right. This time we have added Whispers of Doom to this. This allows us to double up on our curses, so that's why we can apply both conductivity and hypothermia. This is especially helpful when we're facing single targets and also bosses. We will make our way down to the Lingering Whispers node at the bottom here, which is super helpful. It increases the curse duration, so you're not having to sit there and cast more frequently. These curses do take up quite a bit of mana, so the less that we have to cast them, the better. But of course, we do also like the increased effect of our curses here as well. We will then make our way over to the right, where we will stop and grab the Controlling Magic node. We also will eventually be grabbing this additional critical chance node here as well. And then we want to stop and grab Patient Barrier along with Ingenuity. And then we'll make our way down where we're going to grab Brahmana. We'll also grab Arcane Intensity as well as Ether Flow. But be sure to not grab Eldritch Battery since we took off Atziri's Disdain. We also need to make sure we're taking this one off as well. And then finally, we'll continue making our way over to the right, where we'll stop and we'll grab Energize and also Invocated Efficiency and the surrounding nodes. And then we'll finish this up by grabbing these remaining nodes here, Careful Assassin, to give us some increased critical hit chance. Now, once you've grabbed all of those nodes, you have a couple of options. You can continue making your way down and over to the left and attempt to go for the Jugular and True Strike nodes here. However, for me, instead of grabbing these guys, I am going to make my way back up here and grab Master of Hexes and the surrounding nodes down here as well to increase the effect of our curses. And then also, like I mentioned earlier, we will be grabbing the Spell Critical Chance. And then finally, the last ones that we're going to grab once we get the points is going to be the Reverberation node down here, and along with the Spell Critical Damage nodes down here. And that should bring us all the way to the maximum amount of points that were allotted for this build. Let's also take a look at our character stats. So this is what we're looking at here. Like I mentioned, our energy shield is showing at 4152, but we are able to double up on this thanks to our Grim Feast. Our mana should be somewhere around 2000. And then If we can get 10 more spirit, like I mentioned, we can also add blink onto this build, but for right now, we're going to have to do without. Now, taking a look at our resistances, they're pretty well balanced with the exception of cold and chaos. If we can take some away from cold and add it onto chaos, that'll bring us up to the max for all of them. But for right now, this is pretty close to that. Now, taking a look at our energy shield recharge rate, we're at 1152, which seems to be pretty good. If we can get a increased start to energy shield recharge would be really great as well. And then for our mana, we have a 321 mana recovery rate per second, which seems to be pretty good. I'm hearing some people have a way of getting up to 700 plus. I think that's great, but the 321 seems to be more than enough for what we're doing here. And that is all I got for you guys for today. I hope you guys liked this video and enjoyed the build. If you guys did, please don't forget to like, subscribe, and comment below. Thank you guys so much for watching, and until next time, Exiles.